Radio Sweden, Monday. Stockholm, Yeow, Malmo, Gothenburg, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm Gabby Katz here with Bill Schiller at Broadcasting House. And we look back at the 3rd International Poetry Festival. That's coming up, so don't go away. The Radio Sweden team would really like you to stay. You've put up with my lousy rhyming, but I have to say it was all inspired by the 3rd International Poetry Festival. They're much better at it than me, and a literary publication based in Stockholm, Moscow, and New York did the honors at the poem-packed event. Our own cultural editor, Bill Schiller, who is also better at poetry than myself, met some of the visiting poets and the magazine's editor, an ex-Soviet citizen now at home here in Sweden.
Maybe you too sometimes fantasize that God resembles your most difficult teacher, the one who never gave you the highest mark.
My name is Alexander Deriv, and I'm the editor and publisher of the online and in-print Journal of Poetry Translation and Art, Ars Interpres, originated in Stockholm since 2003.
Born in Russia.
Yes, well, in the former Soviet Union, better to say.
Organizing an international poetry festival. What happened this year?
Well, this year festival was the 3rd one. This one has brought together many poets from Sweden, Singapore and other countries for a series of literary events. The poets who performed there gave talks and launched a new issue of Ars Interpres. Also Peter Lindgren, Lasse Soderberg, Deepak Mazumdar, Catalanian poet Anthony Albalat and Danish Ulrike Gernes.
What kind of poems now?
All types of poetry, from very dramatic to very humorous poems. And I should say that among the various venues where poetry reading took place during this festival, none was more unusual than pub department store.
And people there shopping, buying clothes, and watching the poets.
And now listen to the poets.
How did they react?
Very well. Even some was shocked.
But somewhere under -120, ice gains viscosity, return to liquid, start to melt again.
My name is Haengsuk Tian. I'm from Singapore.
Bringing in what kind of poems now to this festival? What did you read for the audience?
Oh, all right, because I feel very strongly about being a Chinese, brought up in a very Chinese environment, but having to learn English. So the poems that I read earlier were about the tension between a Chinese who have to learn English in order to use it for economic reasons.
And you're a teacher as well.
Yes, I try very hard. Yes, I'm a teacher by profession. Yeah.
What kind of teacher of what subject?
I teach both English language and English literature. Yeah.
How does that go together? Being a poet and being a teacher, do they complement each other or difficult or what?
Yeah. No, they do complement each other because I have to explain sometimes certain ideas and feelings in English literature using the language. And most of the English literature that we studied is mainly British literature, sometimes American literature. So essentially literature in English. So it's complementary, that's for sure.
How do you think the Swedish audience responded to your poetry?
Well, after I read, she came up to me and said she felt that she could identify with a bit of what I was sharing because she's actually Belarusian and she's come to live in Sweden, you know. So she did say that she could identify a little with it. I think most people nowadays, because of the modern world, feel that they are living in two worlds. Could be the world that they're born in, and then for various reasons they have gone out to work, they have married other people. So I think all of us now inhabit or live in more than one world. It's no longer like the village world of our parents or our grandparents. So it is something very universal, I think. And even if you're not two different worlds, always your own private world and the outer world. So we always are shuffling between two worlds, I think. Imagine the wilderness in rainforest humidity instead of barren moors. Is it worse there as a poor, bad-cloaked animal?
Do you know? I'm Yokai Tan and I'm from Singapore.
Poetry now about what? What is the subject?
Poetry, I write about experimental poetry, and I write about intermedia like movies, music, television, and how they convert in this current world.
What kind of reaction are you getting now from the audience here in Stockholm?
I think the audience in Stockholm is very respectful and they're very eager to hear what you have to say. And from what I could see, they do relate to some of the references like music and movies that I refer to like Ingmar Bergman, which I think is nice.
What does it mean to you to be participating in this international poetry festival in Stockholm?
It's very revealing to see how poets from different worlds talk and, exchange ideas. And I really, really appreciate the opportunity given by the organizers at the Writers' Union.
We heard some people from Croatia, some people from Belarus. Mm-hmm. Comparison, poetry similar, international, or totally different from country to country?
There are similarities in the way people share about the feelings about family, about grandmother and things. But there are also differences which I'm very attracted to, like the way people react to different things, like different languages, the way they pronounce the words are different. And I think that's part of the musicality of poetry.
A poet in Singapore, can you make a living? Can you survive? Do you have to work something else? How difficult is it to be a poet in Singapore?
A poet in Singapore, it's quite embarrassing. You can't be a full-time poet. You have to have a whole daytime job. For myself, I'm a journalist, so being a poet is like an escape route to do what you like to do after office hours. But gradually you have a growing scene of poets who are writing, and they are getting the respect as well and the publicity. So I think it's definitely growing.
Are there some subjects that are taboo? I understand it can be very difficult sometimes to get your message across in a very well-organized and maybe dominant Singapore. What's taboo? How far can you go?
Taboo is a very good area of why poetry can be used as a channel. If you can't discuss gender issues or politics or gay or, race and everything. But poetry is where you can discuss this through metaphors and through different ways of figurative language. So I think poetry is a perfect channel to discuss all these potentially controversial issues, and that's why we write. We talk about these issues through our poetry when we can't talk about in our main media.
Without getting into trouble from censors or authorities who say, what kind of poem is that? Why are you talking about that subject?
I think that's part and parcel of society gradually opening up and realizing that there are people with different sexual orientation or racial and politics and everything. And that's why you have that. And the more you push, the better the society becomes. And I think we are part of the process. And one day or later, we can become like Sweden, as open as ever.
A boy from the neighborhood tells you that they are dead. He says, look, even the Beatles died. Never mind your parents. Besides, who knew them except you?
I'm Valjean Mort from Belarus.
And what kind of poems did you read tonight?
Well, I read my poems from my book of poetry translated into Swedish. In Swedish it's called Tårarnas fabrik, Factory of Tears.
And this was a very ironic poem about everything going badly in society, but where people are in pain and crying, it's going very well. Why did you do this?
Well, in Belarus, after the end of every year, the government publishes all kinds of annual reports from different factories and industry in general, so that we know how many tractors we produce and how many nightgowns. So this is what I was making fun of. I invented this factory of tears that is working really hard, and it's a heroic factory, and I'm a worker there because I'm a crybaby.
So in this Eastern European dictatorship, pain and agony and tears production is very, very good, but everything else is going down the drain.
Well, not everything else is going down the drain, but for sure that pain and tears are number one.
In school, I surpassed even my teacher, declaiming about the exploitation of the masses, the corruption of the rich who could afford caviar and frogs' legs.
My name is Tim Liardet, and I'm from Bath in England. I teach at Bath Spa University. In 2001, I taught for 1 year in a young offenders prison in England. And during the course of that year, I wrote hundreds and hundreds of poems, which were distilled into a book of poems, of 38 poems, called The Blood Choir. So I'll almost exclusively be reading from that book.
Now, are these about young offenders, about young criminals?
Yes. very much so. They're about individual young offenders, but they're also about me. They're also about my reaction to working in a prison, and I explore the nature of the cultural distance between me and them in lots of poems.
And what was your reaction? Glad to be there, frightened to be there, sorry to be there?
I think the primary emotion would have been fear, and I certainly didn't teach them anything. But I like to think that I was able to build up some degree of trust with individuals, and they didn't come to regard me as someone who was part of the larger conspiracy.
Poems filled with gloom and desperation, or with hope and joy, or what?
A mix of all those things, I hope. I would imagine that they're quite dark, but I mean, it's been incredibly well reviewed in Britain, and I think what all the reviews have said repeatedly is that my poems show the possibility of eking out degrees of freedom even when you're inside the prison. So I guess that's hopeful.
How important is it for you to come to a festival here in Stockholm?
Very, very important. I mean, I've been in touch with Alexander now for, about 2 years, and it's very good to meet him, and it's an exciting city, and the opportunity to read poems in a new city is always an exciting prospect.
What do you think of the magazine itself, Alexander's publication?
I think it's a beautiful magazine. I think it goes from strength to strength. What I like most about it is the way it maximises the number of poems you can get in one issue. It's very unusual. You know, British magazines are too self-consciously tasteful and like to give lots and lots of space, whereas I like the way Alexander just goes poem after poem after poem after poem all the way through.
Because your parents have left, and I'm ashamed to return to you again.
That brings us to the end of today's Monday edition. Our headlines once more: the Swedish moderate conservatives ended their party conference and gave a thumbs up to gay marriages. And Sweden expels Afghan refugees despite growing violence. For those stories and more, do join us online, Radio Sweden.